One thing that I hear quoted again and again is that there's absolutely no Egyptian record of the 10 plagues that are described in the Bible. I beg to differ, and that's what today's special episode is all about, is how did the Egyptians cover up the existence of the 10 plagues? In part 3 of the evidence for the Exodus, we went over Amenhotep III's reign and that he erected 730 statues in a large temple to the goddess, lowercase g, Sekhmet, and that according to Egyptian mythology, she is the goddess of plagues, healing, and doctors. It is also important to note that plagues in ancient Egypt were her messengers or slaughterers, depending on the context, and they obeyed her commands. So the question is what kinds of plagues did she command? Now, before we get to the plagues, we should go over the origin story of Sekhmet. And here is it in a very quick nutshell. Mankind is in rebellion against Ra, so Ra sends Hathor down to destroy mankind. After initial success, Ra decides that this is enough and withcalls Hathor and says, "Thank you, you've done a great job." However, Hathor, filled with bloodlust, becomes Sekhmet and desires to go on a rampage. In an effort for the gods, plural, to save mankind, they mix red ochre with beer and flood the place where Hathor is going to start her rampage. She shows up and decides to drink this red blood, becomes drunk, and fails to recognize mankind. Thus, mankind is saved. Some important things to note about the story I just told you. It comes from a book called The Heavenly Cow, or Celestial Cow. The interesting thing about this book is that it is written in two different Egyptian vernaculars. One is Middle Egyptian, and the other is New Kingdom Egyptian, also known as Late Egyptian. So here's the interesting piece. The destruction of mankind, which is the story of Sekhmet, is in the earlier Egyptian, which means it was possibly reworked for a later Egyptian audience. Now, there is certain thematic elements, or what they call motifs, that run through this book that parallel Genesis, and scholars have been quick to note this, going as far as to even say that it may have influenced the mythology, quote, of the Judeo-Christian tradition. Now, I disagree. Just because something is written earlier does not mean that it is more true than something that is written later, especially when one claims to be a historical book and the other is a tale. Next, let's get to the Sekhmet statues and litany. So, I've already mentioned that Amenhotep III erected 730 statues in a large temple. Now, on each of these statues, there were certain epithets, and an epithet is it's a description of a quality or a characteristic. Now, you notice that there are 60 of them on these different statues, and that they are the same ones that are written in the Sekhmet litany, which we will be going over. So this is something that has been consistent over time from this point. So how many of these epithets of Sekhmet happen to relate to biblical plagues? We can immediately rule in the Nile running red with blood because of the origin story. Now, it doesn't bother me that this story happens to predate the Exodus. In fact, it is my thoughts that this is where they got the inspiration to use Sekhmet in the first place. In the litany, there's a line that talks about protection from every evil fly. There are two biblical plagues where flies are mentioned, the plague of gnats and the plague of flies. Another line says, "One for whom the desert animals have been killed, past tense, on the account of the fear she inspires." There are multiple plagues where animals die. The frogs die, the livestock died, the fiery hail killed animals, even after they had been replaced from the death of the livestock. There is also the death of the firstborn. Another line says protection from every pestilence of the year. the Egyptians suffered with boils and disease as part of the biblical plagues. Sekhmet is also referred to as the Lady of Flame, and there are multiple references to flames in the litany, and that corroborates fiery hail. Sekhmet is also referred to as the Lady of Vegetation and Generous One, which could be a reference to the locusts or fiery hail because both of these destroyed vegetation. Another line says that Sekhmet's flame gives faculty of sight. There was the plague of darkness. And there is another line that asks Sekhmet to protect the people, his wife, the Pharaoh's wife, and his children, which very well could be a reference to the death of the firstborn. This next line we weren't specifically looking for when we went to review the Sekhmet plagues, but it certainly is interesting. Preserve him, the Pharaoh, from the one who plots against him. This is a potential reference to Moses. Another important thing to note about this litany is throughout the entire structure of it, there are ongoing references to of the year. So it is my thoughts that the Exodus probably took a number of months or pretty close to a year. So there you have it. Not only do we have most of the plagues represented within the Sekhmet litany, but we actually have a potential reference to a person who's plotting against the throne, which could be Moses. Here's my conclusions about the anti-plague worship around the time of Amenhotep III, that they recycled the story of an earlier goddess, lowercase g, that was originally used to cover up the flood narrative. They are now reusing to cover up the plagues of Egypt, which would mean that they understood the meanings of those plagues, and that would mean this verse is true. And the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand against Egypt and bring the Israelites out of it. So, going back to our timeline, we're going to add Sekhmet worship source as evidence of biblical plagues. Thank you for watching Evidence for the Exodus. Again, this is the cover-up of the Egyptian plagues. Next time we are going to have another episode, and this one is going to focus more on Pharaoh's tomb and the typology that we find there. We'll catch you then.